Michael sat in his dimly lit apartment in Ohio, staring at the same four walls he had seen every day for the past 15 years. The air was stale, the furniture outdated, and the silence suffocating. The divorce had left him hollow, stripped of purpose, and questioning every decision he had made in life. His kids had grown, built lives of their own, and while he was proud of them, he couldn't shake the overwhelming sense that he had become obsolete. Work was the only thing that had kept him sane, but even that had lost its meaning. The thought of spending the next 20 years in this cycle of monotony was unbearable. He needed something else, something different. The idea of leaving everything behind started as a fleeting thought, but over time, it became an obsession. The internet became his escape. Late at night, he would sit in front of his laptop, searching for stories of men like him who had walked away from their past lives and started anew in distant places. He read about retirees living like kings in Southeast Asia, their pensions stretching far beyond what was possible in the States. He watched videos of beaches with white sand, crystal clear water, and people smiling as if life had never been a struggle. The Philippines came up over and over again, a land of affordability, warmth, and, as many claimed, genuine companionship. The idea of finding love again didn't seem impossible there. He wasn't naive. He knew he wasn't a young man anymore. But the thought of waking up next to someone who actually wanted him, someone who would appreciate him, stirred something inside him. Was this desperation? Was he running away from something or toward something? He told himself it didn't matter. What mattered was that staying in Ohio was no longer an option. He started researching everything cost of living, visas, expat communities, even the nuances of dating Filipino women. The forums were full of advice. Don't fall too fast, be cautious. Some women only want your money. But others spoke of happiness, of finding family, of feeling valued in a way they never had back home. That was what Michael wanted to be valued. The planning phase became an obsession. He calculated his savings, checked his pension, and created spreadsheets that detailed how long he could survive without working. He sold his car, most of his furniture, and gave away things that no longer mattered. The act of letting go was liberating. He didn't need the weight of his past dragging him down. He told his kids about his plan, and their reactions were mixed confusion, concern, mild amusement. His son asked, "Are you sure this isn't a midlife crisis?" His daughter was more direct. "Dad, just promise me you won't do anything stupid." Could he promise that? He wasn't sure. The day of his departure arrived faster than expected. As he sat at the airport, passport in hand, he took one last look at the world he was leaving behind. The familiarity of it, the predictability, the utter lack of excitement, it was suffocating. The flight was long, a brutal 20-hour journey that gave him too much time to think. He had never been to Asia before. He didn't know the language beyond a few basic phrases. He had no job waiting for him, no structured plan beyond his initial budget. All he had was the belief that life had to be better somewhere else. Manila hit him like a freight train. The moment he stepped out of the airport, the heat smothered him. The air was thick, the streets alive with movement, sound, and chaos. He had seen videos of this, but nothing could prepare him for the sheer density of life crammed into every inch of the city. Horns blared, vendors shouted, people moved in waves, and the traffic was unlike anything he had ever experienced. His taxi weaved through narrow streets, passing neon-lit bars, towering malls, and crumbling buildings that stood defiantly against the passage of time. Everything felt overwhelming, yet strangely exhilarating. His first few days were a blur. The hotel was decent, the people polite, but there was an undercurrent of something he couldn't quite place in awareness, that he was an outsider. He wandered through the streets, trying to take it all in. The food was different, the smells intense, the smiles abundant. Filipinos had a way of making even the most mundane interactions feel warm. But beneath that warmth, Michael sensed a cautious curiosity. He wasn't the first foreigner they had seen wandering these streets, and he wouldn't be the last. Loneliness set in faster than he expected. He had envisioned adventure, connection, excitement, but instead, he found himself eating alone, walking alone, existing in a place that didn't yet feel like his own. The bars were full of other foreigners, men his age and older, many with young women at their sides. Some looked genuinely happy. Others seemed lost in a fantasy they refused to wake from. Was this what he had come for? To sit in a dimly lit bar, nursing a beer, waiting for someone to approach him? He resisted at first. He wasn't here for that. He wanted something real, something meaningful. But real took time, and time was something he wasn't sure he had the patience for. The first woman he met was named Jenny. She was 27, beautiful, with dark eyes that sparkled when she laughed. She worked at a cafe, or at least that's what she told him. Their conversations were easy, her interest in him flattering. She asked questions about his life, his past, his plans. She made him feel important, desired. When was the last time a woman had looked at him like that? It felt good. Too good. The first request for help was Smala's sick mother. A late rent payment, nothing unreasonable. He barely thought twice about it. What was a little money if it meant helping someone he cared about? But small requests grew into larger ones. The warmth in her eyes shifted, just slightly, when he hesitated. Was it genuine affection, or something else? Did it even matter? He had come here to feel alive again. But was this life, or was it another trap? Michael sat in the small apartment he had rented in Manila, staring out the window at the city that never seemed to sleep. The initial excitement of arriving in a new country had started to fade, replaced by a growing unease that he couldn't quite shake. The days were hot, humid, and long, and although he had imagined this adventure as a fresh start, reality was beginning to set in. Everything was different here. The streets were alive with noise, the smell of grilled meat mixed with car exhaust, the relentless sound of honking from the endless traffic jams. The people moved with a rhythm that he had yet to understand, speaking in a mixture of English and Tagalog, sometimes switching between the two so quickly that he couldn't keep up. The first real problem he faced was the language barrier. He had read that English was widely spoken in the Philippines, but what the travel guides didn't tell him was that understanding and being understood were two very different things. Sure, many people spoke English, but the accents, the local slang, and the cultural nuances made communication far more difficult than he had anticipated. Ordering food was simple enough, but anything beyond that often led to confusion. He found himself smiling and nodding when he didn't understand, pretending to follow conversations he had already lost track of. It didn't take long for him to realize that being a foreigner came with a certain kind of attention. Everywhere he went, people noticed him. Some stared, others smiled politely, but there were also those whose eyes lingered a little too long, as if calculating something. He wasn't sure if it was curiosity, admiration, or something else. The vendors at the markets would quote him prices that were far higher than what the locals paid. The taxi drivers conveniently forgot to turn on the meter, and even the friendly conversations sometimes led to subtle requests for money. It was a strange feeling to be both welcomed and targeted at the same time. Finances became another unexpected issue. He had done the calculations before leaving the States, but the cost of living was more complicated than it had seemed on paper. Yes, things were cheaper, but only if he lived like a local. The moment he sought out the comforts he was used to air-conditioned apartments, Western food, imported beer, the costs started to add up quickly. And then there was the matter of the currency itself. The peso was deceptive. A meal for a couple of 100 pesos seemed cheap until he realized how many of those cheap meals he was having every day. His bank account, which once seemed sufficient for years of comfortable living, suddenly felt fragile. More than anything, though, it was the loneliness that hit him the hardest. He had spent years dreaming of an escape, of finding somewhere he could finally feel free, but freedom, he was beginning to realize, wasn't the same as belonging. He had left behind his old life, his familiar surroundings, and even his problems, but what he hadn't anticipated was that without those things, there was a hollow space inside him that he didn't know how to fill. He walked through the crowded streets alone, ate his meals alone, and returned to an empty apartment at the end of the day. There were people everywhere, yet he felt more isolated than ever. The loneliness made him vulnerable. That was why, when Jenny entered his life, he let his guard down faster than he should have. She had been working at a small cafe he had started frequenting, always greeting him with a bright smile and an enthusiastic, "Good morning, sir." She was young, far younger than him, but there was something in her energy that drew him in. She laughed easily, asked him questions about his life back in America, listened as if his words mattered. The first time she sat with him on her break, he felt something stir inside him that he hadn't felt in years. Attention, connection, the simple pleasure of being seen. Their conversations became longer. She told him about her life, how she worked long hours to support her family, how things were difficult but she never lost hope. There was something about her optimism that was intoxicating. He wanted to believe in it, to believe in her. And when she agreed to meet him for dinner outside of work, he felt a surge of excitement that made him feel 10 years younger. The first few dates were magical in their own way. She was warm, affectionate, and never let the conversation die. She listened to his stories, touched his arm when she laughed, leaned in close as if he was the most interesting person in the world. He had been warned about this, about the way some women knew exactly what to say and how to act to make a foreigner feel special. But he ignored the warnings. He wanted to believe it was real. The first request for money was small. Her mother was sick, nothing serious, just a doctor's visit she couldn't afford. He hesitated, but then reminded himself that back in the States, he wouldn't think twice about lending a friend a few dollars for something important. What was a little help? The next time it was rent just a little short this month. Then her brother's school fees. It was always something, always small enough to seem reasonable but never ending. Somewhere deep down, he knew he was being tested. She was seeing how far she could go, how much she could ask before he said no. But by the time he realized it, he was already in too deep. He wanted to believe that she wasn't like the others, that she really did care about him. And maybe, just maybe, she did. But care didn't change the reality she needed money, and he had it. That was the foundation of their relationship, whether he wanted to admit it or not. The final straw came when she asked him to invest in a motorcycle for her cousin. "It's a good business," she had said. "He can do deliveries, make money, help the family." That was when the doubts started screaming at him. Would it ever be enough? If he gave her the money, would she ask for more? What if he said no? Would she still want him, or would she simply move on to the next foreigner who was willing to pay? The doubt was suffocating. He wanted to believe in love, in second chances, in the idea that maybe, just maybe, he had finally found something real. But reality had a way of creeping in, whispering that maybe he was just another Mark, another lonely man looking for something he would never truly find. And so, he tested her. He told her he couldn't afford to help anymore, that things were tight, that he needed to be careful with his money. He waited for her reaction, and it came faster than he expected. The warmth in her eyes faded. The texts became less frequent. The excuses began. "I'm busy with family. I have work. I'll see you when I can." And then, one evening, he saw her, sitting at another cafe, laughing with another foreigner, her hand resting lightly on his arm the same way it had rested on his. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had been played. Or had he? Maybe it was just the way things were. Maybe, in a country where survival was a daily battle, love was just another transaction. The question was, what would he do next? Would he leave, return home, admit defeat? Or would he stay, learn from his mistakes, and try again? Michael wasn't sure. But one thing was certain: he would never look at love the same way again. Michael sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun lazily overhead. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of diesel fumes, fried food, and the faint, lingering dampness of an approaching storm. The city outside was still alive, even at this late hour. Cars honked in the distance, voices carried through the night, and the occasional burst of laughter echoed from the nearby streets. But inside, there was only silence. Silence and the slow, gnawing realization that he had been nothing more than a fool. The image of Jenny sitting across from another man was burned into his mind. The way she laughed, the way she leaned in, the way her fingers lightly traced the back of the foreigner's hand. It was a performance, the same one she had played with him. And yet, for all his cynicism, for all the warnings he had read online, he had let himself believe. He had wanted to believe. How had it happened? How had a grown man, a man who had spent decades making logical, calculated decisions, fallen into something so predictable? It wasn't the money that bothered him. He could recover from that. It was the humiliation, the sense of betrayal, the feeling of being exposed as nothing more than another desperate, aging expat clinging to the illusion of youth and romance. He had no one to blame but himself. He thought about leaving, packing his bags, booking a flight back to the States, walking away from this chapter of his life before it swallowed him whole. But then what? Return to Ohio? To the same empty house, the same predictable days, the same feeling of irrelevance that had driven him here in the first place? He wasn't ready to give up yet. He had come to the Philippines looking for something: freedom, purpose, maybe even love. And while he had found none of those things, he wasn't convinced they were impossible. He had simply been reckless, naive. He had let loneliness make decisions for him, and now he was paying the price. But that didn't mean he had to give up. The first step was acceptance. He needed to face the truth. He wasn't special. He wasn't the first foreigner to be scammed, and he certainly wouldn't be the last. There was an entire industry built around men like him, who arrived with open hearts and open wallets, desperate for connection. The women who played this game weren't evil. They were survivors. In a country where poverty was a constant shadow, where families relied on each other just to get by, taking advantage of a willing foreigner wasn't just an opportunity, it was a strategy. And he had been an easy target. He had been weak. That had to change. Michael spent the next few days in a haze of reflection, avoiding the places where he might run into Jenny, ignoring the messages she had sent when she realized he had gone silent. He had nothing left to say to her. But he wasn't ready to isolate himself either. If he was going to stay in this country, he needed to understand it better. He needed to find a way to exist here that didn't rely on fantasy. So he started watching. He walked the streets with new eyes, paying attention to the way people interacted, the way money changed hands, the way foreigners were approached, the way certain women targeted certain men. He noticed the older expats who had been here for years, the ones who weren't sitting in bars with young women clinging to their arms. They were different. They blended in. They spoke bits of Tagalog. They weren't easily impressed. He needed to become one of them. His first real connection came through Mark, an Australian in his 60s whom he met by chance at a quiet coffee shop away from the tourist traps. Mark had been in the Philippines for over 20 years, and it showed. He was lean, tanned, dressed in simple clothes that didn't scream foreigner with money. He spoke with a confidence that suggested he had seen it all. And when he caught Michael eyeing his coffee, he smirked. "Let me guess," Mark said, leaning back in his chair. "You've been here a couple of months, got yourself a pretty little girlfriend, and now you're wondering how much of it was real." Michael hesitated, then nodded. Mark chuckled. "Mate, it happens to all of us. The first one always gets you." There was something both reassuring and unsettling about his words. The ease with which he said them, the certainty in his tone, the implication that this wasn't just a mistake, it was a rite of passage. Over the next hour, Mark laid it all out. The reality of being an expat in the Philippines. The women who saw foreign men as walking ATMs. The scams, the setups, the ways men were lured into situations they couldn't escape from. But he also spoke of the good of genuine relationships, of finding purpose, of building a life that wasn't just about chasing an illusion. "You can still have a great life here," Mark said, finishing his coffee. "You just have to be smart about it. Learn the language, make local friends. Stop throwing money around like it means nothing. And for God's sake, stop looking for love in all the wrong places." Michael listened, really listened, and for the first time since arriving, he felt like he understood what he had been doing wrong. He had approached this place like a tourist, like a man looking for a shortcut to happiness. But there were no shortcuts. If he wanted a real life here, he had to build it the right way. That night, he deleted Jenny's number, blocked her messages, let go of whatever foolish hope he had still been holding on to. She had played her game well, but he wasn't a player anymore. He was done being a mark. The next morning, he woke up with a new sense of clarity. He wasn't leaving, not yet, but he also wasn't going to make the same mistakes. It was time to start over, this time with his eyes open. The question was, could he really change? Could he become the kind of man who thrived here instead of the kind who got eaten alive? He wasn't sure, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to find out. Michael woke up earlier than usual, the air in his small apartment already thick with humidity despite the sun barely beginning to rise over the horizon. He lay still for a moment, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, his mind replaying the events of the past few weeks. The realization of how easily he had been manipulated still burned in his gut, but beneath the sting of betrayal, there was something else resolve. He wasn't going to let one mistake define his entire experience in the Philippines. If he was going to stay, he needed to adapt. He needed to be smarter. He pushed himself out of bed, made a cup of instant coffee, and sat by the window, watching as the city came to life below him. Vendors wheeled their carts onto the streets, men and women in business attire squeezed into overcrowded jeepneys, and children ran barefoot along the sidewalks, their laughter ringing through the air. Life here moved at a different rhythm, one he had yet to fully grasp. Mark's words from the previous day echoed in his mind. Learn the language, make local friends, stop throwing money around like it means nothing. The advice was simple, but executing it was another challenge entirely. He had spent his entire life in a structured environment engineering projects, deadlines, predictable routines. Here, nothing was structured, nothing was predictable. It was chaos, but within that chaos, there was something appealing. He spent the morning walking through the quieter streets of Manila, avoiding the usual tourist hotspots. He found a local eatery tucked between two crumbling buildings and forced himself to order in broken Tagalog. The waitress smiled at his effort, correcting his pronunciation gently, and for the first time since arriving, he felt a small sense of progress. As the days passed, he continued making small changes. Instead of eating at the Western restaurants that catered to expats, he tried local food stalls, learning to appreciate the flavors and textures of dishes he had once found too unfamiliar. He resisted the urge to take taxis everywhere and started using public transportation, despite the discomfort and confusion it initially brought. He struck up conversations with locals, sometimes failing miserably, sometimes making a genuine connection, and most importantly, he avoided the bars and the women who hovered around them, sensing easy prey. His biggest breakthrough came when he met Luis, a middle-aged Filipino man who ran a small internet cafe near his apartment. Michael had stopped in one evening, needing a reliable connection for a video call with his daughter back in the States. Luis had noticed him struggling with the lagging Wi-Fi, and after a few minutes of casual conversation, offered him a seat behind the counter where the connection was better. "You're not like the usual foreigners around here," Luis remarked, watching Michael with a curious expression. Michael chuckled. "And what are the usual ones like?" Luis smirked. "Older men drinking too much, chasing girls half their age, spending money like it grows on trees. Then they disappear after a few months, broke and bitter." Michael exhaled slowly. "I was almost one of them." Luis didn't seem surprised. "But you're still here. That means you learned something." From that night on, Michael found himself spending more time at the cafe. Luis had lived in Manila his entire life, and through their conversations, Michael began to understand the unspoken rules of survival in the city. He learned which areas to avoid, how to tell when someone was genuinely being friendly versus when they were looking for an opportunity, and most importantly, how to navigate relationships in a culture so vastly different from his own. "You want to stay here long term?" Luis asked one evening as they sat outside drinking beer from brown bottles. Michael hesitated before nodding. "I think so. I just need to find a way to make it work." Luis leaned back, considering him for a moment. "Then stop thinking like an outsider. Stop looking for what you had back home. You're not in America anymore." The simplicity of that statement struck Michael harder than he expected. He had been trying to build a life here while still holding on to the expectations and mindset of a man from Ohio. But this wasn't Ohio. The rules were different. The people were different. And if he wanted to thrive, he had to change not just his habits, but his entire way of thinking. One of the biggest lessons came when he started noticing the way money influenced relationships. It wasn't just about scams or opportunistic women, it was deeper than that. In the Philippines, family came first. Obligations stretched far beyond the individual. A son who made money was expected to support his parents, his siblings, his cousins. A woman dating a foreigner wasn't just dating for herself, she was dating for her family's future. Money wasn't just currency here. It was survival, security, and responsibility all wrapped into one. That was why so many men like him fell into the trap. They mistook financial dependence for love. They wanted to be needed, to feel important, to play the role of provider. And when they finally realized what was happening, it was too late. The lines had blurred, and the relationship had become nothing more than a transaction. Michael knew he couldn't let that happen again. It wasn't about being cold or refusing to help. It was about setting boundaries, about knowing when generosity turned into expectation. He had already lost enough to his mistakes. He wasn't going to lose himself too. A month passed, and with it, a quiet transformation. He no longer moved through the streets like a tourist. He had memorized the jeepney routes, learned how to haggle in the markets without offending the vendors, and started greeting the security guards outside his building by name. He wasn't just living in the Philippines anymore. He was starting to become a part of it. One afternoon, as he was leaving the cafe, Luis called out to him, "You ever thought about working here?" Michael frowned. "You mean like..." "What? Helping out with the computers?" Luis shrugged. "Why not? You know your way around technology. I could use an extra hand, and you could use something to do besides wandering the streets all day." Michael considered the offer. He had never thought about working here. His pension had always seemed enough. But maybe that was part of the problem. He had been living without purpose, without a reason to get up in the morning besides escaping his past mistakes. Maybe this was what he needed. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "I think I'd like that." It wasn't a grand plan. It wasn't the life he had imagined when he first landed in Manila, full of naive dreams and misplaced hopes. But it was real. It was something. And for now, that was enough. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if he would stay in the Philippines forever or if, one day, he would return to the States with a new understanding of himself. But he did know one thing. He wasn't running anymore. For the first time in a long time, he was exactly where he needed to be. Michael had never thought of himself as a man who could start over. Reinvention was something reserved for younger people, those with energy, ambition, and the luxury of time. He had always believed that, by the time a man reached his 50s, his path was already set. And yet, here he was, in a cramped internet cafe in Manila, troubleshooting a customer's faulty connection as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The work wasn't glamorous. Most of the computers were outdated, their keyboards sticky with years of abuse. The internet was unreliable, prone to sudden blackouts that sent customers into a chorus of frustrated groans. But there was something oddly satisfying about it solving problems, keeping his hands busy, feeling useful again. For the first time in a long time, he had a routine. He woke up early, walked to the cafe, helped Luis with whatever needed fixing, and spent his evenings drinking beer on the rooftop, watching the city stretch out beneath him. It wasn't the dream he had arrived with, but it was real. One evening, after closing the cafe, Luis invited him to a small family gathering. Nothing fancy, he had said, waving a hand dismissively. Just food, beer, maybe some karaoke if you're feeling brave. Michael hesitated. He had spent so much time trying to avoid the traps that ensnared other foreigners that he had also avoided genuine connection. But Luis wasn't like the others. He wasn't looking for anything. He was just a friend. And friends were rare in this city. The house was small, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood that Michael had never ventured into before. Inside, it was alive with laughter, the scent of grilled fish and garlic rice filling the air. Luis's relatives greeted him with warm smiles, offering him a seat, piling food onto his plate before he could refuse. At first, he felt like an outsider, watching from the edges, unsure of his place in this tight-knit gathering. But as the night went on, as the beers flowed and the conversations became livelier, he started to relax. He listened to their stories, their jokes, their struggles. He saw the way they cared for one another, the way family wasn't just a word here, it was a foundation. And then there was her. Her name was Maricel, and she was nothing like Jenny. She was closer to his age, her face lined with the quiet strength of a woman who had lived through hard times. She wasn't overly flirtatious, didn't drape herself over him like the girls in the bars. Instead, she was reserved, observing him with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "You've been here a while now," she said, nursing a glass of water as they sat on the small balcony away from the noise inside. Michael nodded. "Almost 6 months. And you still don't know how to eat with your hands properly." She smirked, glancing at the plate of food beside him. He laughed. "I'm learning. Slowly." She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Most foreigners don't stay this long unless they have a reason. He considered that. "I thought I had one once. Turned out to be the wrong reason." She nodded as if she understood. "So what's your reason now?" That was the question, wasn't it? Why was he still here? What was he chasing? He exhaled, leaning back against the railing. I just want to stop running." Maricel didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice was softer. "Then maybe you're in the right place." The night stretched on, and for the first time in months, Michael felt something stir inside him that wasn't regret, or loneliness, or the dull ache of disappointment. It was something simpler. Something lighter. Hope. In the days that followed, he saw more of Maricel. Not in a whirlwind romance kind of way, but in small, meaningful moments. She would stop by the cafe, sometimes bringing him food, sometimes just sitting quietly as he worked. She never asked for anything, never hinted at expectations. She was just there. And that, more than anything, made him want to know her more. But he was cautious. He had been fooled once. He wouldn't let it happen again. One evening, as they sat outside the cafe, watching the rain pour down on the street, he turned to her. "What do you want from me?" She looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. "I've been here long enough to know how things work. Foreign men come, women see an opportunity. I need to know if this is real." Maricel didn't look offended. If anything, she looked amused. "Do you think every woman here is after your money?" "That's what I've been told." She shook her head, sighing. "Some are, but not all. Some of us just want something real, too." Silence settled between them. "Then let's take it slow," he said finally. "No expectations, no pressure." She smiled. "I think that's a good idea." And just like that, something shifted. Michael still didn't have all the answers. He still didn't know if this was where he belonged, if this was the life he was meant to have. But for the first time, he wasn't rushing to figure it out. He wasn't desperately searching for meaning in all the wrong places. He was simply living. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.